She was the babysitter, not a mother, so she gets a babysitter's share. That's the first thing my younger sister said when we sat down to divide our mother's estate. Vivian in a cream blazer, smiling at me across the mediator's table, like I was the hired help who'd wandered into the wrong room. She left home at 18 and never came back. I raised our two youngest for 11 years after our mother got sick. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my bag and set one sealed envelope on the table. Yeah, because there was one thing in that room that Vivian was certain did not exist. Inside that envelope was a single page from the county courthouse, stamped, dated 19 years ago, signed at the bottom by a judge. Filed on a Tuesday when my sister was already 2 states away and didn't bother to ask what was happening to the children she left behind. The page doesn't argue about who deserved more. It simply states who a court of law named when somebody had to become the parent in that house. Vivian had already told the mediator in that bright, confident voice of hers that everything should be divided 4 equal ways. She had no idea the law had written one name down a long, long time ago. Come sit with me a minute. Some stories I only tell on the nights the house goes too quiet. The kind of quiet that finds you when you remember every birthday you spent being the grown-up in a room full of children who needed one. So let me ask you something before we begin. If the family that vanished came back for the inheritance and called you the help, would you raise your voice and fight them on their terms? Or would you let the court's own paper say your name for you? Hold on to that. Now, let me tell you how it began. My name is Maren. I'm the oldest of 4. After me came Vivian, 2 years younger, the bright one, the pretty one, the one the relatives meant when they said that girl is going places. And then, a good stretch behind us, came the 2 we always called the little ones. My brother Theo and my sister Rosie, born close together, 8 and 6 years old in the year everything in our family came apart. We grew up in a yellow house on Linden Street, in a small town in the middle of Ohio, the kind of place where the same families have sat in the same church pews for 3 generations, and everybody knows whose porch light burns late. Our father died when I was 15. A heart attack at the lumber yard, there in the morning and gone by lunch, the way the worst things tend to happen. And our mother, Eleanor, did her best to hold the 4 of us together for a while. She really did. I want to say that plainly because nothing that came later was her fault. I'll tell you one thing about my mother from before the fog because it's the only way you'll understand the rest. The autumn after we buried our father, she sat me down at the kitchen table one night, after the little ones were asleep, and she did something she'd never done with Vivian. She opened the family papers in front of me, the deed to the house, the folder where the bills lived, a small gray fireproof box with a key she wore on a chain. She showed me how the lid latched, where the important things went, and she said, in a voice that was already a little frightened of itself, "Maren, you're the one who notices when something's wrong. If a day ever comes when I can't, you'll know where everything is." I was 16. I thought she was just being careful. I had no idea she was handing me, years early, the one habit that would save us. The habit of keeping the truth where you can put your hand on it in the dark. That gray box is going to matter. Remember it. But grief did something to my mother's body that none of us understood at first. Within 2 years of burying my father, she started forgetting things. The stove left on, the bills unpaid, my name some mornings. The doctors used careful words and then less careful ones. Early onset, they finally said. The kind that comes for a woman far too young, that takes the mind a little at a time and then all at once. By the time I was 19, my mother could not safely be left alone with 2 small children. She wandered. She forgot Rosie in the bath one afternoon, and a neighbor heard the crying through an open window, and after that, everyone agreed something had to change. Here is the part you have to understand because it is the whole spine of this story. When that something had to change, there were exactly 2 people old enough to change it. There was me, 19, just finished 1 semester of community college, working part-time at a pharmacy. And there was Vivian, 17, about to graduate at the top of her class, with a full scholarship to a university 400 miles away, and a suitcase already half-packed. And Vivian went. I want to be fair to her, so I'll tell you she had her reasons, the way everyone always does. She said she'd worked too hard to throw it away. She said staying would ruin all of our lives, not just hers. She said somebody in this family ought to make something of themselves, and she was the one with the brains to do it. She climbed into a packed car the week after graduation, and she waved at the little ones from the window, and she drove off down Linden Street toward the rest of her life, and she did not look back at the yellow house in the mirror, because if she had, she might have had to feel something. I'll tell you the exact moment, because I have never been able to put it down. It was the morning she left. Rosie was 6, and she didn't fully understand that Vivian wasn't coming back, so she'd made her a card. A folded piece of paper with a crayon drawing of the yellow house and 4 stick figures holding hands. She ran out to the car in her socks to give it to her, and Vivian, with the engine already running, took it and smiled and said, "That's so sweet, baby," and set it on the dashboard and pulled away. We found that card a week later, dropped in the gutter at the end of Linden Street, soaked through from a rain. I dried it on the radiator and I kept it. I'm telling you this not to make you hate her, though you can if you want, but so you understand that there was never a version where she didn't know what she was leaving. She drove over the evidence of it on her way out, so that left me. I did not have a big speech about it. There wasn't time for speeches. There was a social worker at our kitchen table with a folder explaining that if a responsible family member did not step forward to take legal custody of Theo and Rosie, the state would have to place them, possibly together, possibly not, possibly in our town, possibly nowhere near it. And I sat there, 19 years old, and I looked at my little brother's scared face and my little sister's wet eyes, and I heard myself say the only thing my heart would let me say. I said, "I'll take them. They stay with me." That sentence cost me everything I thought my 20s were going to be, and I have never once regretted saying it. The court did not simply take my word for it, and thank God they didn't, because that piece of paper is the reason we are sitting here tonight. A 19-year-old cannot just declare herself a parent. There was a process. There was a petition and a home study and a stern woman who came to inspect whether I had food in the cabinets and smoke detectors on the ceiling and any idea what I was doing. And then there was a day in a county courtroom, a Tuesday in the fall, when I stood in front of a judge in the only nice clothes I owned and answered his questions, and he looked down at me over his glasses for a long moment, and then he signed an order. Legal guardianship, care, custody, and control of the minor children Theodore and Rosalind, granted to Maren, in writing, stamped with the seal of the court, dated. I remember the judge said one more thing, off the record, after he signed. He took off his glasses and he looked at me. Really looked, the way grown men almost never looked at a 19-year-old girl in that town. And he said, "Young lady, people are going to forget what you did here today. They're going to take it for granted the way people always take for granted the one who stays. But the court won't forget. The court wrote it down. So when the day comes that somebody tries to tell you what you were to these children, you bring them this paper and you let the paper do the talking." I thought it was just a kindly old man being grand. I drove home and I filed it away, and I did not think about those words again for 19 years. I think about them every single day now. He knew. He'd seen it before. He was telling me to keep my evidence where I could put my hand on it in the dark. The same thing my mother had told me at 16, in almost the same words. 2 people, years apart, warned me of the exact day that was coming. I just didn't know I was being warned. I drove home that afternoon a 19-year-old who, by the power of the state of Ohio, was now a mother of 2. I put that order in a manila envelope, and I put the envelope in the gray fireproof box in my closet, the same box my mother had shown me at the kitchen table. And apart from the day I had to show it at the school to enroll them, I almost never took it out again. I didn't need a paper to tell me I loved those kids. The paper was just a formality. That's what I believed for 19 years. What followed were the hardest, longest, and in some strange way, the most precious years of my life. I dropped out of college. I took a second job. I learned to braid a 6-year-old's hair before sunrise and still make it to a shift on time. I went to the parent-teacher conferences. I was the one in the bleachers at Theo's middle school games, the only person there without a husband beside her. I was the one who sat up with Rosie through the fevers and the nightmares, and later, the heartbreaks. I signed the report cards. I bought the prom dress. I taught my brother to drive in the church parking lot on Sunday afternoons. 11 years. From the time I was 19 until the youngest of them left for her own life, 11 years, I was their mother in every way that the word actually means, even though I never once asked either of them to call me anything but Marin. And our own mother? Eleanor lived on for all those years, but she lived behind a fog that only thickened. For a while, she stayed in the house with us, in the back bedroom, and I cared for her too. So I was raising 2 children and tending a parent who no longer fully knew me all at once before I turned 25. Later, when it became more than one person could safely do, she moved to a care home across town, and I visited every Sunday, and she would smile at me sometimes the way you smile at a kind stranger. She held on like that, half here and half gone, for 19 long years. And then this past winter, quietly in her sleep, she finally let go, which brings the money into it. Because my mother, it turned out, still owned the yellow house on Linden Street. It had been paid off decades ago, sitting in her name all this time while I kept the taxes paid out of my own thin paychecks. The house, and a small savings account my father had left, and a life insurance policy nobody remembered. It added up to something. Not a fortune. But to a family like ours, it was the first real money any of us had ever stood near. And the moment there was money, my sister Vivian, who had not set foot on Linden Street in 19 years, came home. I'd love to tell you she came home for the funeral. She came for the reading of accounts. She flew in 3 days after we buried our mother, and she did not come to my door. She went to a lawyer's. The first I heard of it was a letter, a formal letter, on heavy paper, informing me that my sister was contesting the distribution of our mother's estate, and that the matter was being referred to probate mediation. I had to read it twice to understand it. My sister, who had not paid one school fee, not driven to one doctor's appointment, not sat up through one single fever in 19 years, was hiring an attorney to make sure she got an equal quarter of everything, an equal share, the same as the children she abandoned, the same as me. Let me sit in that for a moment because I think it's where the real wound is, and I don't want to rush past it. You can survive a lot when you're the one who stayed. You can survive the exhaustion and the loneliness of doing it all alone, and the slow disappearance of the life you thought you'd have. What you don't expect, what nearly broke me, sitting at my kitchen table with that lawyer's letter in my hand, is that after giving up everything, after 11 years, the person who walked away gets to come back and stand beside you as an equal and say, "We're the same, you and me. We're both just her children, divide it evenly." As if the years were nothing. As if love that shows up every single day for over a decade weighs exactly the same as a phone call on Christmas. There's a particular kind of grief in being measured as equal to the person who left, and finding out the world has no scale that can tell the difference. I cried that night. I'm not too proud to tell you that. I sat in the house I'd grown up in, the house I had quietly kept standing, and I cried like the 19-year-old I'd been when that car pulled away down Linden Street and left me with 2 frightened children and the whole rest of my life. And then, somewhere in the middle of the crying, I remembered the gray box in the closet. I went and I got it. I knelt on the closet floor and I turned the little key, and I lifted that lid I hadn't lifted in years, and the first thing I smelled was the old paper and metal smell my mother's hands used to smell like. And I took out the manila envelope and I unfolded that single page from the county courthouse, and I read the words I had almost forgotten were there. Care, custody, and control of the minor children Theodore and Rosalind granted to Marin. signed by the judge, sealed by the court, dated in the fall, 19 years ago. And I understood, sitting on my closet floor, that I was not holding a formality after all. I was holding the truth, written down and made official by the state of Ohio on the very week my sister chose to drive away. A truth she did not know existed, because she was already gone the day it was signed. And I'll tell you what stopped my breath, kneeling there. The date on the order and the date Vivian's old college had stamped on a photograph that still hung in our mother's hallway, her freshman move-in day, grinning on the steps of a dormitory 400 miles away, were the same week. Not the same month, the same week. While I was standing in front of a judge promising to raise her abandoned brother and sister, she was hanging fairy lights over a dorm bed and starting the going places life. The law and her absence were written down on the same page of the calendar. I didn't plan that. God didn't owe me that. But there it was. I want to be honest with you about the kind of woman I am, because it explains what I did next and what I didn't do. I did not call Vivian and wave that paper in her face. I did not post anything. I did not call our relatives and start making my case the way she'd surely been making hers. I just put the order in my bag, and I waited, and I let her keep building her stage, because I have learned, the hard way, that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the heaviest thing. And Vivian did build her stage. Over the weeks before the mediation, I started hearing it from the cousins, from the aunts, Vivian's version. And her version was a small marvel of cruelty, because it took the truth and turned it exactly upside down. In her telling, I was not the sister who sacrificed. I was the sister who got stuck. I was the one who never amounted to anything, who never finished school, who never married, and who had, poor Marin, she'd say it so gently, quietly moved herself into Mom's house and gotten herself made the favorite so she could end up with everything. She told them I'd manipulated a sick old woman. She told them the little ones only sided with me because I'd raised them to. She took 11 years of my life and rebranded them as a long con, and she did it with that warm, reasonable, going places voice, the one the family had been trusting since she was a girl. The first escalation came on a Sunday by phone. My cousin Diane called me. Diane, who I'd thought of as a friend, who I'd let cry on my shoulder through her own divorce. And in a voice gone careful and cool, Diane told me that maybe, for the sake of the family, I ought to just agree to the 4-way split and not make this ugly. That Vivian had explained her side, and that it would look very greedy of me to fight a grieving sister over a house. I sat there with the phone against my ear, and I realized Vivian hadn't just told her story. She'd gotten ahead of mine. She'd made the truth itself look like greed before I'd said a single word. I thanked Diane for calling. I did not defend myself. I hung up and I put my hand on the bag where the envelope was, just to feel it there. The second escalation was worse because it walked right up to my door. About 10 days before the mediation, Vivian came to the Yellow House, the only time she set foot on Linden Street in all of it, not to make peace, but to be seen making peace, because she'd brought our Aunt Carol along as a witness. She stood in my mother's kitchen, the kitchen where our mother had handed me the family papers a lifetime ago, and she offered me, in front of Carol, a generous deal. She'd let me keep a little extra for my trouble, $10,000 off the top if I'd sign away any claim that I was more than a caretaker. For my trouble. 11 years of my life, the college I never finished, every fever and every braid, reduced to a tip you leave for good service. And she said it sweetly, watching Aunt Carol's face the whole time to make sure it played as kindness. I said no, quietly, and I watched something flicker behind her eyes. Not guilt. Calculation. She'd expected me to either take it or explode, and I'd done neither, and for the first time she didn't know what I was holding. Here is the mini reveal, the thing I learned in that kitchen that I hadn't known before. When Vivian set her purse on my counter, a folder slid half out of it, and I saw the letterhead of an appraisal company and a figure circled in red. She hadn't just hired a lawyer. She'd already had the house appraised from 400 miles away before our mother was even cold, and she'd done it months ago. Months before the funeral. While I was still sitting by our dying mother's bed on Sundays, my sister had been on the phone getting the market value of the roof over my children's heads. This wasn't grief curdling into greed at the reading of accounts. This had been a plan since before the end. She didn't come home because Mom died. She came home because the asset finally came loose. And I understood then that I wasn't dealing with a wounded sister at all. I was dealing with someone who'd been waiting 19 years for the house to be worth collecting. And now I have to tell you about Aunt Carol, because she is the part of this story I almost lost, and the part that nearly turned. Carol was our father's sister, the elder of the family, the one whose opinion the cousins and aunts all quietly took their cue from. She'd known us all our lives. And in the weeks before the mediation, Vivian had worked on Carol harder than on anyone, because Carol's voice was the one that could swing the whole family one way or the other. By the day, Vivian stood in my kitchen with that generous offer. Carol was more than half convinced. I could see it in how she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. My own aunt had started to believe I was the schemer. That's how good Vivian was. But Carol was old enough to remember things Vivian was counting on everyone forgetting. After Vivian left that day, Carol lingered on the porch a moment, and she said something that told me the door wasn't all the way shut. She said, "Maren, your mother trusted you. I never understood why she trusted you more than the smart one, but she did." And then she went home, and I knew she was sitting with that. I didn't chase her. I didn't plead my case. I'd learned by then that you don't win the elder of a family by arguing. You win her by being, consistently, the person the arguing is about. So I waited. And 3 days before the mediation, Carol called me. She said she'd been going through some of my father's old things from the lumber yard, and she'd found the letters my father used to write her when we were small. And in one of them, dated when I was a girl, our father had written, "My oldest, Maren, is the steady one. If anything ever happens to me, that's the child who'll hold this family together." Carol read it to me over the phone, and her voice broke because she'd just remembered, in my dead father's own handwriting, who I'd always been. She said, "I owe you an apology I'm ashamed of. I'll be at that mediation, and I'll be sitting on your side of the table. Hold on to Carol, she matters at the end." By the time the day of the mediation came, I knew exactly what I was walking into. I knew she had the cousins half convinced. I knew the youngest two, my Theo, my Rosie, both grown now, both living their own lives in other cities, were caught in the middle, loving me, but unsettled by their big-shot older sister and her lawyer and her certainty. Vivian had even managed to make them doubt, just a little, whether the way they remembered their childhood was really the way it happened. That's the part that still makes my hands go cold. She tried to take even the truth of how I'd loved them and make them question it. The mediation was held in a beige conference room above a bank downtown, the kind of room with a long table and a box of tissues set out hopefully in the middle. Vivian arrived with her attorney, a sharp young man in an expensive suit. I arrived with my bag on my shoulder, and with Aunt Carol beside me, her chin up in her good church coat. I watched Vivian's smile catch, just for a second, when she saw who I'd walked in with. She'd been so sure she had Carol. The mediator, a tired and decent-looking woman named Ms. Albright, explained that her job was to help us reach a fair division without the expense of court. She asked if either party would like to begin, and Vivian began. Of course she did. She was good. I'll give her that. She didn't shout. She was gentle and sorrowful, dabbing at her eyes, talking about how much she loved our mother, how she'd grieved from afar, how she only wanted what was fair for all 4 of Eleanor's children. She talked, smoothly, about how it was natural that the sibling who'd lived rent-free in Mom's house all these years might feel entitled to more, but that the law, she was sure, would see 4 children equally. She used the phrase rent-free in front of Carol about the house where I'd raised her abandoned siblings, and then, with the softest possible smile aimed across the table at me, she said the thing I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. She said, "I know Marin did a lot of the day-to-day around here, and we're all grateful, truly. But let's be honest with ourselves. She was the babysitter, not a mother, so she should get a babysitter's share. The house and the savings, divided 4 equal ways. That's what Mom would have wanted. That's only fair." The room went quiet. Her lawyer nodded. Ms. Albright glanced at me with something like pity, waiting, I think, for me to cry or to argue or to come apart. Beside me, I felt Aunt Carol go rigid with anger. I could feel her gathering herself to speak, to defend me, and under the table I put my hand on her arm. "Not yet," I told her without a word. "Let it stand, let the whole room hear it land." Because I knew something Carol's anger didn't. The cruelest version of that sentence, spoken out loud into a silent room, was about to become the best thing that ever happened to me. Here is the truth of what was happening inside me. I wanted, with everything I had, to stand up and scream the whole 11 years across that table. The 4 in the morning fevers, the 2 jobs, the braids before sunrise, the college I gave up, the prom dress and the driving lessons and every report card I signed with a hand that should have been signing my own homework. I wanted to make her feel the weight of 1 single year of it, let alone 11. I felt my eyes sting and my throat close, and for one long second, the 19-year-old in me wanted to fall apart in that beige room exactly the way Vivian was hoping I would. But I didn't, because I'd learned something across all those quiet years that my sister never had to learn, out there in her bright, going places life. I'd learned that the truth does not need you to shout. The truth just needs you to be holding it when the room finally goes silent. So I let the silence stretch. I let it get long and uncomfortable, long enough that Vivian's lawyer shifted in his seat, long enough that Vivian's confident little smile began to tighten at the corners, because she'd been braced for tears or fury, and instead I'd given her nothing. And nothing, to a person who has rehearsed her whole performance against your reaction, is the most unnerving thing in the world. Ms. Albright opened her mouth to move things along, and only then, into that taut and waiting quiet, did I move. I reached into my bag. I felt every eye in the room follow my hand. I took out the manila envelope, the one that had lived in my mother's gray box for 19 years, soft at the corners now from age, and I slid it across that long table, slowly, until it stopped, gently, right in front of my sister and her expensive lawyer. And I said the first words I had said since I walked into the room. I said very quietly, "Before we divide anything 4 ways, Vivian, would you do me one favor? Open that and read out loud the name the judge wrote down." She looked at the envelope like it might bite her. Her lawyer reached for it, but I said, not unkindly, "No, I'd like my sister to read it, out loud, to the room." She earned that. Vivian opened the envelope. Her hands had begun, just slightly, to shake. I watched her pull out that single yellowed page, and I watched her eyes move across the top of it, and I watched the color drain out of her face the way water drains from a glass when you tip it slowly, from the bottom up. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. She tried again, and the only sound was a small, dry click in her throat. She looked up at me and then down at the page, and then, this is the part I'll never forget, she looked at the date. I saw her find the date. I saw her do the arithmetic she'd spent 19 years never doing, and I watched her realize that on the week she was hanging fairy lights over a dorm bed 400 miles away, a judge in this very county had been signing my name into the space where a parent's name goes. So Ms. Albright, the mediator, gently took the page from her hand and read it herself, in a careful official voice, into that silent room. She read the name of the county court. She read the date, 19 years ago, the fall, that Tuesday. She read the words order of legal guardianship. And then she read the line that mattered, the line that turned the whole room on its axis: care, custody, and control of the minor children, Theodore and Rosalind, hereby granted to their sister, Marin, by order of the court. She set the page down, and she said, quietly, mostly to Vivian, "Ma'am, this isn't a question of who babysat. A court of law named your sister the legal parent of these children 19 years ago. This document is the law." I have never heard a room go so still. The hum of the air conditioning was the loudest thing in it. Vivian sat there with her hands flat on the table, staring at that page, and I watched 19 years of a story she'd told herself, and everyone else simply fall apart in front of her, with no lawyer's objection that could put it back together. Because you cannot argue with a court order. You cannot soften it or spin it or dab your eyes at it. It does not care how warm your voice is. It just says, in the cold, flat language of the law, what is true. And what was true was that on the very week my sister drove away, the state of Ohio had looked at our broken family and written my name in the place where the parent's name goes. And it was Aunt Carol who broke the silence. She stood up, slowly, the way the elder of a family stands when she's about to say the thing everyone will repeat for years. And she looked down the table at Vivian, and she said in a voice that did not shake at all, "You called her the babysitter in front of me, knowing I'd carry it back to the family." She let that sit. "I almost did, Vivian. God forgive me. I almost carried your story for you. But your mother trusted Marin. The court trusted Marin. Your own dead father trusted Marin, in his own handwriting. The only person in this family who never trusted Marin is the one who wasn't here to see her earn it." And then Carol sat back down, beside me, on my side of the table, and she did not look at Vivian again. I'd brought the leverage. She had built the whole stage, the lawyer, the mediation, the 4 equal ways. She just never knew she'd built it for me. I won't pretend the next part was loud or triumphant, because that isn't how these things really go. There was no cheering. Vivian's lawyer cleared his throat and quietly said he'd need to review the document and confer with his client, which is what a man in an expensive suit says when the floor has just dropped out from under his case. The mediation was paused, and in that pause, my sister finally looked up from the table and looked at me. And for the first time in 19 years, there was nothing performing in her face. Just a frightened woman who had walked into a room certain of who she was and learned she was someone else. She tried, once, to talk. She started in about how she hadn't known there was a court order, how nobody told her, how it didn't change the fact that we were all Mom's children. And then she heard the words coming out of her own mouth, the same plea she'd just been making, and they died in the air, because everyone in that room now knew exactly what those words were worth. The youngest 2 weren't there in person, but they would hear, that very evening, what the paper said. And when they did, the doubt Vivian had so carefully planted in them about their own childhood simply evaporated. You cannot make a grown man doubt who raised him once a judge has already answered the question in writing. Here is what I did then, and it's the part I most want you to hear, because it's the part nobody ever tells you about. I did not ask for everything. I could have. I sat there holding a court order that named me the legal parent and my abandoning sister as nothing more than an absent sibling, and any lawyer alive would have told me to press it for all it was worth. But that is not the woman those 11 years made me. So I told Miss Albright and I told Vivian what I wanted, and it was this. The house on Linden Street, the house I kept standing for 19 years, would be put in trust and sold, and the proceeds would be divided 3 ways, between Theo and Rosie and me. The 3 of us who had actually lived there, the 3 of us who were actually a family. Not because Vivian was owed nothing as our mother's daughter. She would keep her quarter of the savings and the insurance, every dollar of it, and I would not touch it. But the home, the years, the thing she called babysitting, that part was ours. And then I set the boundary. in the same quiet voice, looking right at her. I said, "You don't get to come back after 19 years and tell my brother and my sister who raised them. You don't get to rewrite it. The money you can have your share of, Vivian, with my blessing. Money was never the thing you took from me. But you don't get to take the truth. That door is closed. You closed it yourself the day you drove away and didn't look back. I'm just the one telling you it's locked." She signed the agreement within the week, a woman holding a contested claim with a sealed court order sitting in her sister's bag and her own lawyer telling her she'd lose, does not have much room to bargain. And then the consequences rippled out, the way they always do, one stone after another. My cousin Diane, the one who'd called me to say I shouldn't make this ugly, called me again, this time crying, to apologize for taking Vivian's side, to tell me she felt sick about it. I told her there was nothing to forgive. Vivian was very good, and a lot of people had believed her, and I didn't hold it against the ones who came back. The cousins who'd been keeping a cool distance started showing up again. A casserole on the porch, an invitation to a christening, the small, ordinary currencies of a family deciding which way it faces. Aunt Carol made sure of that. She went around the family the way only the elder can, and she said simply, "I was wrong and I won't be wrong again." And that closed the matter for everyone who'd been waiting to see which way Carol leaned. The house was sold that spring. Theo used his share for a down payment on a home for his own little family. Rosie paid off the loans from the nursing degree I'd helped her start. And I finally, at 38, went back and finished the college I'd walked away from at 19, in the same town, the long way around. On the day of my own small graduation, Theo and Rosie were both in the audience, and so was Aunt Carol. And when they called my name, the three of them stood up and clapped before anyone else did, and I had to look at the ceiling for a moment so I wouldn't come apart in front of the whole hall. As for Vivian, I'd love to tell you she apologized. She didn't, not really. People like my sister rarely do, because an apology is an admission. An admission would mean facing the size of what she drove away from. What she did instead was go quiet and small and distant. The family that had trusted her warm going-places voice for so long slowly turned their faces back toward the truth, one by one, and there was nothing she could say to turn them back. The porch light she'd always warmed herself by, that easy admiration from everyone in the room, it went dark, gently, and stayed that way. She got her quarter of the savings, exactly as I'd promised, and I'm told she never cashed the check for a long time, as if cashing it would make it real, would make it the final receipt for everything she'd actually chosen. As for me, I drove home that evening to the yellow house one last time before it sold, and I walked through the empty rooms where I'd raised 2 children into good people, and I let myself feel all of it. And I want to tell you, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally being seen. There is a difference, and you only learn it when you've gone a very long time without either one. So here we are, you and me in the quiet. Doors, not walls. That's what I keep, even after all of it. I didn't ruin my sister. I didn't take her share, though I held the paper that could have. I didn't drag her name through the cousins the way she dragged mine. I just closed one door, the door to the lie. And I built my brother and my sister a room she can never get into, a room with the truth in it. And then I went back to the quiet, unglamorous, unrewarded work of having been somebody's mother. For the nights, the house is too quiet. And they are quiet now, with my mother gone and the little ones grown and flown. I tell myself that being recognized is not something you can force anyone to give you, but the truth doesn't need them to give it. The truth just needs you to keep one sealed page in a fireproof box, and the steadiness to slide it across the right table, and the patience to wait until the room goes silent and somebody finally reads your name out loud. And Aunt Carol, she comes by on Sundays now, the day I used to keep from my mother. We don't talk about the mediation much, but once, near the end of a long afternoon, she took my hand and she said, "Your mother knew. That's why she showed you the box and not the smart one. She wasn't trusting you with her papers, Marin. She was trusting you with her children. She just couldn't find the words for it before the fog took them. And I think Carol is right. I think my mother, in the one clear autumn she had left, looked at her 4 children and chose the steady one, and then lost the words to ever tell me so. Which brings me to the last thing. Because when the lawyers were sorting through my mother's papers to settle the estate, they found something none of us expected. A second envelope, older even than the court order, tucked inside the lining of my mother's old jewelry box. It was addressed to me in my mother's handwriting from before the fog took it. From a year I would have still been a teenager. I haven't opened it yet. It's sitting in the gray fireproof box right now, beside the guardianship order. And I think I already know it's going to tell me something about why my mother trusted me with everything. And something, too, about Vivian and the real reason she could never bear to come home. But that's a story for another night. Come sit with me again when you're ready, and I'll tell you that one too. Until then, keep your doors where you can see them. And tell me, down in the comments, if the one who left came back and called you the babysitter, would you have slid the paper across the table the way I did and let them read your name? Or would you have made them hear every single one of those 11 years out loud? I think about that more than you'd guess. I'll be reading. Good night.